Elena Cruz never asked for anyone to believe in her because she had learned long ago that belief was something handed out sparingly to people who fit a mold, and she had never once fit any mold, not at the academy, not in the barracks, and certainly not in the cockpit of an Apache. She had studied longer, trained harder, and pushed further than most of her peers, but still they smiled at her like a novelty, like a joke, someone to humor until she failed because they all expected her to fail, and that fact lived with her like the hum of the turban beneath her booch. Had come from a border town in New Mexico, the kind of place where the only things that moved fast were the dust devils and the sirens, and she had grown up with two brothers who thought roughhousing was love, and a mother who stitched her uniforms in silence while the TV played news of wars that felt a world away. Elena had watched those wars with a strange ache in her chest, something that felt like fire and hunger, and the need to prove that she could be more than what the world kept saying she would be. She enlisted at 18, and by 24 she was sitting in the simulator 6 days a week, sweating through her flight suit while instructors barked orders and other cadets snickered. In the back, Rothy said she was too small to handle the stick, too slow to think under fire, too soft to kill when it mattered. They said her hands shook when she landed. They said her eyes flinched under pressure. They said she'd crash if they ever put her in real combat, so they didn't. Not at first. They kept her on recon flights over clear skies and sand that stretched into forever missions where nothing ever happened, and the worst danger was aboard tech forgetting to fuel the bird. But Elena never coasted, not once. She checked every bolt, every readout, every map. She memorized every possible failure mode of her aircraft. She flew like the sky was watching, and one day there was a storm coming in from the Gulf, a hurricane that bent trees sideways and lit up radar screens like fireworks, and somewhere in the eye of that storm was a convoy smuggling experimental tech toward a rebel stronghold, the kind of tech they didn't want reaching enemy hands. High command needed eyes on it fast, and they needed someone who could fly low enough to see but smart enough not to die, and every name thrown out came with a reason why not, until someone on the far end of the table said Cruz, and silence followed. Theol knew her record: clean flights, sharp reactions, no panic under stress. She had the numbers, but not the nod, because numbers weren't enough in that room full of clipped tones and decorated doubt. But the storm wouldn't wait, and neither would the convoy, so they called her and gave her a briefing that was mostly warnings, handed her the mission like a dare, and watched to see if she'd flinch. But Elena didn't flinch. She nodded once, asked for grid coordinates, and walked out with her helmet under her arm and fire in her spine. That night the wind screamed like it knew her name, and the hangar doors shook on their hinges. But the bird was ready, and so was she. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Ramesh, looked pale under the red lights, but he didn't ask to be reassigned, and Elena respected that. They went up at 0-10 into a sky that churned like boiling oil. Visibility was nearly zero, and the instruments jittered from the pressure, but the Apache held steady because she knew it like a second skin. For the first 30 minutes, all they could see were sheets of water and flashes of angry light, the kind that blurred your vision and made you question every decision that brought you to this point. But Elena flew steady, one hand on the cyclic, the other moving across toggles with the ease of muscle memory. Her voice in Ramesh's ear was calm even when the tail rotor warned of cross winds strong enough to tilt the fuselage. Dipped low, skimmed over treetops blurred by the storm until the LZ flickered on radar, and there they were, 5 vehicles with no transponders moving through flooded terrain, slower than usual but still moving. Elena marked them on her screen, tagged the coordinates, and called it in. But command didn't just want eyes, they wanted a hit. She was the only one close enough to do it, and she had one shot before the storm swallowed them all. Ramesh asked if she was sure, and Elena only said lock weapons before they lost line of sight. And that was when the real flying began. The wind clawed at the Apache as if trying to rip it from the sky, but Elena did not flinch. She leaned forward into the storm like she was daring it to hit harder. Her fingers danced over the controls, and the targeting system flared to life, a red halo forming around the lead vehicle in the convoy just for a second before lightning lit up the sky and turned everything white. She counted 3 seconds, then dipped lower, trusting her instincts more Then her visuals, because the rain had blurred the windshield to a smear of chaos. The terrain below was uneven, soaked with water, and treacherous, but she kept her altitude tight because she needed line of sight, and the storm was closing fast. Ramesh confirmed weapons were hot, but warned her that the lock was weak. Too much interference from the weather, and the infrared was cutting in and out like a bad signal. Lena didn't answer him. She was busy reading the dance of light and motion ahead, where the convoy had shifted formation and was starting to spread out. Someone down there had spotted them, or maybe just heard the roar of rotors slicing through the hurricane. Either way, they were trying to scatter, and Elena knew that once they disappeared into the floodplain, she'd never get a second chance. So she flew lower than she ever had before, so low that tree branches scraped the undercarriage and water sprayed up in bursts as the bird screamed over it. She didn't care if it pushed the limits the machine could take it, because she had built trust in it over years of drills and hours of maintenance and late nights fixing what others ignored. A voice crackled in her headset, one of the commanders back at the base, shouting that she needed to abort, that the storm was too dangerous and the mission was no longer priority. But Elena knew better. She had seen the reports, seen the black ink over every document tied to this convoy. This was not routine. This was not some exercise gone wrong, and she knew they would never send someone else if she turned back. Range swore under his breath as turbulence hit and the Apache lurched hard to starboard, but Elena corrected within seconds and never took her eyes off the target. She adjusted pitch, let the targeting computer reset, and finally a solid lock flashed green in her display. She squeezed the trigger without hesitation, and the missile cut through the storm like a bladder. For a moment, the world held still. The wind, the rain, the alarms in her headset all seemed to fall quiet, and then the explosion lit up the earth below like sunrise. Fire and smoke and debris hurled into the air as the lead vehicle vanished into a crater of flame. The rest of the convoy scattered faster, now turning hard into the marshy terrain and disappearing behind walls of water and fallen trees. But Elena was already banking left, already tracking the second vehicle. Her eyes narrowed and her breath steady. She let the targeting computer catch up, even though everything was screaming that the storm was worsening, even though lightning was too close and the metal around her was humming with char. Gesh fired again. Another missile, another direct hit the ground, shook beneath the blast, and debris splashed upward, striking the Apache with enough force to jolt Ramesh into a string of curses. But Elena was already climbing, regaining altitude before the third target disappeared, and then the world shifted. She felt it before she saw it. The tail kicked violently, and a burst of alarms screamed in her headset. The storm had finally found its way into the rotors, or maybe a branch or something from the second explosion had caught them hard. But the Apache was no longer stable. It bucked against her commands, rolling hard left and then dipping nose down. Rams shouted that they were losing control, but Elena was already responding. She cut throttle, then boosted it in quick bursts, trying to correct the spin. Her fingers tightening over the cyclic, her arms shaking now with the force of holding steady against something that felt like gravity itself trying to rip her from the sky. She saw the trees coming up fast, knew that if she didn't regain balance, they would crash nose first into the flooded jungle. But she did not panic. She shifted weight, turned the bird sideways, let one rotor dip just enough to catch air, and then pushed hard against the fall. The Apache groaned like a living thing in pain, but it listened, and it lifted the skimmed tree tops again, the belly of the bird tearing leaves from the canopy below. And Ramesh was pale, silent now, too shocked to speak, and Elena finally breathed again, not because it was over, but because they were alive and still in the air. Command came back over the comms, yelling orders, asking for coordinates, asking if they needed evac, asking what the hell had happened, and Elena didn't answer. At first, she was watching the wreckage below, watching the smoldering ruin where 3 of 5 vehicles now lay burning, and then she saw the 4th breaking cover, trying to double back toward a narrow valley that led to a ridge, and beyond that the border gave no warning this time, no request for permission, just keyed in the last of the coordinates and turned the Apache toward the fleeing shape below. Ramesh muttered something about fuel and damage, but Elena just said one more, and he nodded like someone who had seen enough to understand. That quitting was not an option. They dove again, this time through thicker wind and rising heat from the wreckage. The last missile armed itself on her screen and her vision blurred from smoke and sweat, but she found the target through it all, steadied. The nuz. The return flight was nothing like the one that brought them in, because now the Apache was limping through the sky like a wounded animal, and every second felt like it might be the last. Ramesh kept checking the diagnostics, but most of the screens were either flickering or flatlined, and the stabilizer warning had been flashing for 20 minutes without pause. Elena said nothing for a long time, her jaw locked and her eyes never leaving the horizon, because even though the mission was done, they were not out of danger. The storm was shifting again, wind patterns curling back like claws trying to drag them under. She had flown in rough weather before, but never this rough, not with a damaged tail rotor and low fuel and a bird that was barely holding itself together. She adjusted the trim slowly, carefully, trying to ease the burden on the engine while climbing just enough to clear the ridge line ahead, and the Apache responded with a groan and a shudder like it knew it should have already fallen, but refused to give up. Ramesh asked her once if they should call an emergency evac, if they should just sit down somewhere and wait for a pickup, but Elena shook her head because she knew what the terrain below looked like: nothing but flooded ravines, twisted trees, and no visibility for extraction. Even if the birds were brave enough to fly in this weather, which she doubted, they would make it halfway before command called them off, so she kept flying, eyes darting between the few working gauges and the window ahead, counting every second, every drop of fuel, every sound that didn't belong, and still the sky refused to let up. The wind slammed them sideways again and again, forcing Elena to overcorrect with muscle memory. And sheer Wilf Base came into view like a ghost in the fog, blinking red lights barely visible through the downpour, and Elena radioed in with a voice that was calmer than she felt, requesting priority clearance and emergency ground team on standby, because she didn't trust the landing gear and she wasn't sure how long the main rotor would hold at this pitch. Control tower confirmed, and she brought the Apache in low, circling once, then committing to a hard descent that felt more like controlled falling than flying. She touched down with a screech of metal, one landing skid buckling on contact, but holding just enough for the rest of the bird to stay upright. When the rotors stopped spinning and the engines cut, the silence was louder than the storm. Ramesh leaned back in his seat, eyes wide, face pale, chest heaving, and then he laughed, one short and breathless, and said he thought they were dead for sure. Elena didn't laugh. She climbed out, checked the damage with her own eyes, and only when she saw the bird still in one piece did she allow herself to exhale. The ground crew swarmed the Apache, dragging hoses, checking fuel lines, assessing damage, and whispering behind their gloves, because they all knew they had just witnessed something rare, not just survival, but success in the face of conditions no one else would have even attempted. And for the first time in a long time, Elena felt the weight of what she had done. Danish was ordered to debrief immediately, and she did so, still soaked, still in flight gear, sitting across from two colonels and a major who asked question after question about the mission, about the weather, about the hit confirmations, about how she had flown through conditions that grounded every other aircraft in the region. Elena answered everything clearly, without drama, without exaggeration, and when they asked her why she didn't abort when ordered, she looked them straight in the eyes and said, "Because I knew no one else would." Finish. There was a silence after that, not judgmental, not hostile, just quiet, like maybe they were realizing what they had in her, someone who did not scare easy, who did not quit, and who did not need applause to keep going. She left the debriefing with orders to stand down for 72 hours for rest and medical evaluation, and maybe that was standard protocol, but it felt like something else, like maybe they didn't quite know what to do with her now that she had shown what she was really capable of. Back in the barracks, she showered, dressed in clean fatigues, and sat alone for a while, listening to the rain still pounding the roof, thinking about how close it had all come to ending, thinking about the moment the tail kicked out and she saw the trees rising up at her like teeth. Samin knocked on the door, and it was Ramesh holding 2 mugs of terrible coffee, saying he couldn't sleep and figured she couldn't either, and she nodded and let him in. They sat without talking For a long time until he finally said, they'll be talking about this for years, right? And she shrugged and said, maybe, but talking never did much for me anyway. News of the mission spread faster than she expected because 2 days later, Command called her in again, this time not for questioning but for recognition, and they used words like bravery and precision and extraordinary execution under impossible conditions and handed her a citation that felt heavier than it should have been. Still, some didn't believe it, or maybe they just didn't want to believe that she had done what they never could, because in the mess hall the jokes were quieter now, but they still came. The edge of doubt still lingered in certain glances, and she understood it would never fully disappear, not for someone like her. She went back to flight drills with a bird still under repair and new cadets who stared like she was a ghost story made real. Some asked for tips, others just watched, but none said what they really wanted to say. That she had changed something, and they didn't know how to deal with it. Elena never liked ceremonies, never liked standing still while people clapped or spoke about things they barely understood, but she stood there anyway in front of the hangar where they had first told her she wasn't ready, wearing a pressed uniform with her name stitched sharp above her heart and eyes that did not blink as the medal was pinned to her chest. They called her a hero, called her an example of discipline and courage under pressure, called her an inspiration to every pilot in training, and the crowd nodded and clapped and even cheered when her name was said out loud. But Elena only heard the rotors in her head still spinning through rain and wind and chaos, still slicing through a storm she was never supposed to survive. As others stood beside her, the colonel, the tech chief, the commander from Central, and even Ramesh, who looked like he still hadn't processed everything they had done together. But now everyone wanted to shake their hands, everyone wanted to be close to the story. Afterward, she walked back to the flight line by herself, stood in front of the Apache that had been pulled from rotation and stripped down for analysis, its rotors quiet now, its body dented and stained from the storm and the battle, and she placed her hand on the fuselage without saying anything, because it had done more than anyone had asked, and it had done it with. Hirsch had flown dozens of times since then, but something had shifted, not in how she flew, but in how they watched her now. The instructors who used to double-check her reports now signed off without question, the officers who used to forget her. They now greeted her first. The cadets who once joked about her height, her voice, her silence, now called her Mum and asked to learn from her. But Elena didn't change her schedule, didn't take days off, didn't start making speeches or taking interviews. She still arrived early, still stayed late, still cleaned her own gear, still walked the perimeter alone before every flight, and still wrote notes in her little black book. The one no one else was allowed to touch was moved to a new unit not long after, a tactical assault group with a higher clearance level and a reputation for operating in the kind of places most pilots avoided: jungle, mountains, coastlines lit with crossfire and smoke. Their CO was a man named Briggs, tall, quiet, with a silver streak in his hair and a scar across one knuckle, and when he introduced himself he said he had read her file twice and still didn't believe all of their first mission together was in the Highlands, where cartel movement had grown to bold too fast and intelligence pointed to a lab deep in a valley no satellite could reach. Elena flew lead with another Apache behind her and to recon drones overhead, but weather turned sour fast and visibility dropped below regulation limits. Briggs asked her over comms if she wanted to turn back. She said negative, and he didn't argue. He just followed her through the fog, trusting her instinct, because now people were beginning to understand that Elena Cruz did not need perfect conditions to complete a mission. They found the lab set in a clearing half hidden by overgrowth and surrounded by armed patrols. Elena marked the coordinates and waited for the signal, and when it came she dropped fast, unleashing a barrage of rockets so precise that the rear walls fell in before the alarms even triggered. The second bird followed with suppressive fire, and the drones tracked escape routes, pinning enemy movement before it could scatter. By the time boots hit the ground, the area was already secure. Briggs later said it was the cleanest assault he had ever seen, and that if he hadn't been there himself he wouldn't have believed it, and Elena only nodded because she had seen it before, seeing the look in a commander's Eyes when plans worked better than simulations and nothing had to be explained twice. That operation earned the team a 3-day stand down in the city near the coast, and most of the squad went out, drank too much, and came back with stories they would only half remember. But Elena stayed on base, walked the empty hangars, ran flight drills in the simulator alone, and read field manuals cover to cover because she knew something no one else did, that success never earned peace, it only raised. The bar command started as it was always quiet before the call, not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that wraps itself around your chest like wire because it knows what is coming. Elena felt that silence settle over her bunk like a shadow as the first knock sounded. 3 short, 1 long, the signal she had been waiting for and also dreading since her last mission ended. Briggs stepped in without asking permission, holding a sealed file and a look that said too much before any words passed between them. He set the file on her bunk and said classified, top level, eyes only, and she already knew it was going to be different, not because of the paper but because of the way he was standing, one hand in a fist, one jaw muscle twitching. She opened the folder, slowly reading line by line, maps, photographs, timelines, names, places she had never heard of, and one line circled in red that simply said hostile extraction, high priority, no airspace clearance, proceed under shadow protocol on live. Target was a former operative turned rogue holding data linked to a series of sabotage ops along the northern corridor. He had gone silent after being declared Kia, but surfaced 3 weeks ago on a private channel transmitting encrypted coordinates to someone unknown and possibly hostile. Now he was hiding in the ruins of a facility overrun by militia outside government reach, outside protection. Ella closed the folder and said, when Briggs said, "Wheels up in 2 hours, you're flying solo with a ghost bird, no tail number, no backup, no recovery plan," and her only response was copy. That the Apache they gave her was a prototype stripped of tags and outfitted with low-frequency jammers and stealth plating. She had flown it once in training, and it handled like a hawk, lean, tight, brutal in corners, but delicate in balance. It demanded constant correction, but in return it gave unmatched speed, and Silent Che ran her own systems check, ignored the tech team that tried to assist because she trusted her own hands more than theirs. And when she rolled out onto the airstrip, the lights were dimmed and the tarmac silent, as if the entire base was pretending not to watch. He lifted off without a word, without a calm check, without even a goodbye, because missions like this were not meant to be remembered, they were meant to be done. The flight path was narrow, winding through mountains carved with caves and old war scars, the kind of territory where signals vanished and aircraft disappeared without trace. She stayed low beneath radar, skimming peaks and valleys, using cloud cover and terrain like camouflage, every movement precise, every breath timed with the beat of the blades above her. Hours passed like heartbeats, and when the destination came into view, she hovered behind a craggy ridge, eyes locked on the broken compound below, overgrown, half-collapsed, but still active guards patrolling in staggered loops, small arms, visible faces covered by old militia wraps, and the soft glow of a server still running in the deepest chamber. She found the target by heat signature, alone, crouched in the eastern wing, limping, slightly unarmed, but guarded by 2 men who never left his side. Elena hovered a moment longer, then set the Apache down half a click out, cloaked by brush and hill, and continued on foot. It was not her first extraction, but it was the first time she had no one watching her back, no one to signal, no overwatch, just her breath and the echo of her boots in the mud. Slipped through the fence under moonlight, moving like a shadow, counting every step, every guard, every open line of sight, her sidearm low, her knife ready, but unused. Edge reached the target in 11 minutes, cleared the wing in 3 more, dropped the guards with quick, precise strikes, and hauled the man to his feet. Before he even spoke, she knew it was him. Same eyes, same scar, same smirk that had once been in every training manual as an example of how to survive impossible odds. Tried to say something, tried to explain or justify, but she cut him off with one word: filthy. Moved fast through the rubble, the Apache still hidden, blades quiet, systems warm and ready. She threw him into the co-pilot's seat and climbed in without breaking stride. The sky Above beginning to lighten, with the first stretch of dawn the lifted off just as alarms began to ring, just as shouts echoed across the walls, just as the first muzzle flashes lit the dark, and Aelina pulled hard, banking left and then straight up, dodging old watch towers and burst fire that missed by inch. The man beside her kept looking at her like he was trying to understand what kind of soldier they had sent after him, and she said nothing because talking only slowed you down, and she had no intention of being caught, not now, not after coming this far. She climbed to 10,000 feet before cutting west, rerouting through a path no one would follow, and as the sun broke over the ridge line, painting everything gold, the Apache soared clean through it. No turbulence, no resistance, only quiet again. But now it felt earned. They reached neutral ground just before it, landing on a strip so remote it didn't appear on maps, and she handed off the target to a team in black gear who said nothing, took him without question, and disappeared into a waiting transport that vanished over the horizon in less than a minute. Stood alone beside the Apache again, dust curling around her boots, wind dry and sharp, sun already baking the earth, and for the first time in weeks she let her muscles relax, let the tension leave her shoulders, let her pulse slow. Briggs called her later from an unmarked line, voice rough but proud, said that was the kind of mission no one came back from, and she had done it clean, without injury, without question. She hung up without replying and sat on the edge of the landing pad, eyes on the horizon, the Apache behind her, silent and waiting like a loyal beast somewhere below the mountains. The world spun on, unaware that one pilot alone had changed the course of something bigger than anyone would ever say out loud. The orders stopped coming for a while, and at first Aelina thought it was a mistake, thought maybe the silence meant they were reviewing her last mission, or maybe something had gone wrong in the chain of command. But then she noticed the shift in the way people looked at her now, not like she was one of them, not even like she was above them, but like she was something outside the system entirely, something they couldn't define. Walked through hangars where voices dropped when she passed, not out of disrespect, but something else, something quieter, like fear or awe or both, because her name was no longer just a name. It was a rumor, it was a warning, it was a story whispered at night between pilots who had never seen her fly but swore she could see through storms and never miss a shot. Briggs pulled her aside one evening, said the next phase of her work would look different, said she had earned a seat most never even knew existed, and when she asked him what that meant he just smiled and said some birds fly so high they disappear from radar, and maybe that was where she belonged. No, she was transferred without notice, without ceremony, to a location that didn't officially exist, flown out in a black transport where even the windows were sealed, and when she stepped out the air smelled like dry metal and salt, and Distanchev base was underground, carved into a ridge on a forgotten coastline with no name and no visitors, the hangars built into the rock like secrets, and the aircraft inside sleeker, faster, quieter than anything she had ever seen before. They gave her a new flight suit, no insignia, no rank, no call sign, only a code and a brief that said test pilot, advisor, strike commander, depending on the day, and she adapted like she always had, learned new systems, learned new rules or lack of them, and met people who never introduced themselves by name, only nods and purpose. Her Apache was gone now, part of history, decommissioned and studied by tech teams trying to understand how it had survived what it did, and in its place they gave her something new, something unnamed, something that looked like it was born to hunt stars. It moved like a whisper and flew without sound, and Aelina learned its moods and limits, and slowly it began to feel like home, the same way the old bird once had. The missions came again eventually, but they were different. Now not written down, not acknowledged, not even discussed, only coded signals and handoffs and impossible tasks that no one else was asked to do. Sometimes she flew recon through territories that didn't exist, tracking signatures that couldn't be real. Sometimes she flew precision strikes that left no trace, no noise, no questions, and sometimes she was sent just to see how far something could be pushed, and every time she returned without fanfare, without failure, and still she trained, still She cleaned her own gear, still she checked every bolt and blade, and still she walked alone before every flight, not out of habit, but respect. Word of her reached places. Even classified files couldn't block stories told by people who were never supposed to meet her. Rumors about a pilot who once flew through a hurricane and took out 5 targets with 1 fuel tank and half a tail rotor. A pilot who walked away from crash that should have killed her and landed in zones no satellite could. Naphthy started calling her the ghost in the sky, the storm pilot, the one with no shadow and no fear. But Elena never chased the name, she only flew, and when she wasn't flying, she studied, watched, analyzed, wrote in her black book, and sometimes sat by herself on the outer deck of the base, watching the sun drop into a sea that didn't reflect her facet. She didn't ask for recognition, didn't need applause, because she had already proven what she needed to long ago when the instructors said she'd never fly, when the officers said she'd crash, when the storm tried to kill her, and she flew straight through it anyway. And though she never said it out loud, though she never once bragged or reminded them or claimed anything,